All right, we'll start again now that I've warmed up. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. We are recording this webinar called SEL for Every Family. My name is Matthew Spohr. I'm the marketing director for Equip Our Kids. We're a national campaign promoting universal, comprehensive SEL instruction throughout the U.S. Today's panelists include Dr. Gwen Bass, a parent and a consultant and trainer focusing on education and parenting. She uses her research and expertise to enhance opportunities for marginalized students and to improve educational access and outcome for kids with learning differences. Dr. Lorea Martínez is a parent and the award-winning founder of Heart and Mind, a company dedicated to helping schools and organizations integrate social emotional learning into their practices, products, and learning communities. She's also a faculty member at Columbia University Teachers College. And we're lucky to have Michael Eatman, a parent and founder of Culture 7 Coaching, where he helps organizations build leadership capacity for an equitable and diverse workplace. Before we start, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We will be answering questions in the second half of the webinar. So to start, please mute your microphone and silence your cell phone for good measure. If you have a question during the first half, please share it in the chat window. We'll definitely be watching it and we'll pick it up there. And at the end, we'll be sharing some files in the chat for you to download. We'll be showing you how you can subscribe to a weekly SEL parenting tip from Equip Our Kids and previewing events happening tomorrow for International SEL Day. So you'll want to stick around. And now that I've gotten through all the housekeeping, I'm going to hand it over to Gwen, Lorea, and Michael.
Thanks for having us, Matthew. It's really fun to be able to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. We thought it might be helpful to kind of start by talking about what SEL means to each of us. So I'm going to invite Lorea. Will you share, when you think of SEL, what kind of comes to mind for you?
Yes, for me, SEL is a process that we use to learn, to practice, and model essential life skills. So social emotional competencies are, from a parenting perspective, the skills that we need in order to notice when we are getting frustrated because something is not going the way we want, or when we are trying to connect with the feelings of our kids, to help them navigate some of the challenges they have in school and in their community. So all of those skills are social emotional learning, and I truly believe they have a very important part in our parenting and in our households.
Excellent. What about you, Michael?
Well, Lorea said it best. I think I would just add to that. When I think about SEL, I come from an approach of both an educator and diversity practitioner. And so I think of it as a set of tools that allow young people to navigate their own perspectives as well as others. But also, I would say, Gwen, that it's a set of tools that allow us to move from survival to thriving. And I think it's really important to realize that it has a range of approaches and support systems. So that's what I think about SEL.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think what is kind of interesting, and I should have said this before, like not only are all of us in this work working with educators or institutions or families or what have you, but we also have our own kids. So kind of thinking about like how we integrate this in our work. And for me, having having an SEL frame is really about some intentionality around how I want to support kids in my work or in my home in developing sort of like skills and a frame of mind that like orients them to thinking about who they are, how they fit into the context of the world at large, getting to know themselves. Who am I? How do I understand my own feelings? What do I care about? In some situations, in what situations do I sort of like naturally thrive, and what's more difficult for me? And then in a broader context, being able to sort of like think about and understand other folks in the world in that same way. And so that frame and orientation is something for me, like, I want all kids to be thinking, I have dreams and goals, and I also have like the skills and, complexities mixed with, and sort of like I exist in this context where I also am affected by other people. So really having an understanding of like, who am I? What's my context? And what strategies can I use to sort of engage and have like a habit of mind from a young age that allows me to be thinking about social development, emotional development, and how do I sort of negotiate those two, the outside world and my interpersonal world. So we also thought it might be helpful to kind of share some experiences about how we do this in our own homes and in our own lives. So I don't know, Michael, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure. I'll be glad to share one that's fresh off the press. When I think about SEL, my experience in my home, it's one thing to teach it. It's another thing to go home to it. And just recently, my family, we were visiting one of the cities in New Hampshire, and we had lunch. And as I have a 10-year-old, we're trying to give him increasingly space to be his own person. And so he went out to use the restroom, and a few minutes later, my wife said, "Wow, he's taking a long time. Let's check on him." And I said, "Just give him another second." When he came back to the table, he sat down and his face looked alarmed. And that EQ in us all go, "What is happening?" And Gwen, with tears in his face, he said, "Daddy, someone hit me in the bathroom." So in my heart, literally, my brain went many, many places. One, as a Black man in America. Two, as a dad. Three, as a son. My own dad was with us. And so just kind of thinking about how does social emotional learning work in that moment for both my child and for myself. And so what I had to do is take a breath, because my reaction was to get angry. I was furious. We're recording, so I'll just leave it at furious. But I was furious, but I had to make sure I was processing so my child could also do the same. And so we went all of the paces. We went outside to see if the person was still there. We went to the manager. We made a complaint. And to kind of recap the story, I said, "Let's go back into the bathroom." And now this is my baby. This is my eldest baby. I wanted to go back into the bathroom, not because the person was there. I wanted him to know that it's okay to feel that fear and still let's face it together. So when I think about this tool for going from survival to thriving, it allows us to deal with difficult situations. Not that situation is solved, but for me, when we talk about the importance of SEL for families, it's something that our kids are learning, but it's also something that we have to process. So that is my ready hot story that is still simmering.
And that's like so many, it's a terrible story. I'm like, really, it's an awful thing to like, and then you both kind of, in addition to having done that really great work of being like, let's go in there together, let's kind of be back in the space, now that's inevitably something you're going to be thinking about the next time you give him that leeway or that freedom to go do anything.
Absolutely.
But I think it's also a really good example of all those like micro, strategies that we use in those moments to manage. And I appreciate you sharing it. I'll just share really quickly. One of the things that I think about is I do this thing with my kids where every single day at some point, and I have 4 kids between the ages of 9 and 14. So we're like always busy. Like there's like never like we don't have like a super consistent schedule. Everybody's doing something else all the time. But one of the things we do every single day at some point is to check in, and I just always ask them 3 questions, which is, what was the best part of your day? What was the worst part of your day? And what's something that happened that was a surprise? And we call it high, low, jack. And I love it because my kids know, like if I don't remember to do it, they're like, "Oh, high, low, jack, let's do high, low, jack," and sometimes it happens in the context of our whole, like all 6 of us. And sometimes it's just, one at a time, but it's a great way for me to be reminded, like to be in a habit of just like getting to know them, for them to know like someone's listening when they want to talk about their day. And it's like an excellent jumping off point for so many conversations. So like, around social emotional learning. So it can be like, what was the best part of my day? Oh my gosh, you did that? How'd that feel? What did other people say? Or like that happened. That was really unexpected. I'm so surprised, like, what did you do? Like, how'd you handle it? How did everyone else in class handle it? Like, did anybody do anything? Like, did you have to support anybody else? Like what, kind of being able to unpack some of those situations with them that feel really contextually relevant is much easier and more organic than being like, let's talk about how to develop social skills, really using the examples from their own lives. So I just want to kind of offer that. Lorea, what about you?
Yeah, I love those questions. And I have, my youngest is 8. And if you ask her, how was your day today? You get nothing. So there's one question that really worked well for her, and is, what made you laugh today? And then when I ask that question, then it comes like, oh, this funny thing happened, or we laugh because, during recess, someone said something funny, or this happened with their food. There are always these stories that make them laugh during the day, and just collecting that is important to know how the day went, because they spend many hours away from us. So that's a way and a bridge for connection. I'll offer a more mundane story than Michael, and Michael and I have had many conversations about what it means to be a parent, a diverse parent in the States. But mine today is my oldest daughter's birthday. She's turning 11 today. So last night, my youngest daughter and I were making a birthday cake for her. And it's a special tradition that we always make our birthday cakes at home. And I had this vision of what the cake would look like. So the two of us are in the kitchen making this cake, and I'm telling my daughter, oh, this is what we are going to do. But she has other ideas, and she's like, no, Mom, we can do something else. Let me do this. And I'm like, no, but my idea was this, and we're gonna, set up the decorations this way. So we went back and forth, and I was getting really frustrated, and she was getting frustrated. And I could see myself, sometimes we talk about when you go into, you go into the train, and you are like driving, right, or riding on this train. And the fun of doing this thing together was, oh, Alexandra, if you can mute yourself. Thank you for joining us. We were just getting at each other, and there was a moment when I really paused to notice that it was the fun of this activity, doing this thing together. I was taking that away by being so focused on what was my expectation or my goal for how I wanted this cake to be, right? And I realized that that was not the important thing to fulfill my vision, but to really spend that time together doing something for her sister. And that the SEL skills for me as a parent in that situation, they helped me to not continue to move on autopilot and go with my plan, but really notice and remind myself what is it that is important in this situation, and to be able to say what's important is that we are doing this together, and we can come to a compromise in like how this cake is going to look like. And I think that can happen in many different situations during the day with our kids, where we have a plan or we have a goal, and our kids have other ideas, and it's like, how do we come to a place where we can work together and notice and really remind ourselves what's important in that situation.
Lorea, you're saying that it just reminded me of my middle son. He's very one way or the other, and my Ellis, and so just something simple as dinner. I know that if I give one way, it's going to create a wonderful opportunity for frustration. So I said, just kind of as a strategy, okay, Ellis, we're having dinner tonight, and Mommy and Daddy not going to be there. So what two options would you like? I realized for me, I didn't always do that, because we got something to do. We got to get there. It doesn't matter what I have to push through. I realized that it gave me space to say, here's what we're doing. Here's, I'm acknowledging that he has thoughts as a second child. I'm acknowledging that, giving him some space, and then giving him two options. And even though I chose the option that he didn't want, it was still one of his two. And it helped our evening to go a lot better. And I realized that the SEL work that we've been doing has helped me to check my own self to go, what am I really invested in? And how can I be invested in what my kid needs also to get what will be helpful for me? So that brought that to mind for me. So thanks for helping me think about that.
I feel like you're getting at two things that I see as really important too. Like one is that it just isn't a one size fits all approach. I think a lot of us, especially when you work in schools or when you read through competencies or like talk about how to develop these skills, we talk about it from one particular lens, and it tends to be sort of like, for lack of a better word, sort of like a dominant white lens. Like, what does emotion regulation look like? This is what we say it needs to look like. And I feel like there is this way that like when I think about how to implement this with all families, I think a lot about like, it has to be organic within your family. Like there can't be a prescriptive approach. It has to align with your values. And so many of us, like even in your example, Michael, like when you were talking, I was like, right, because when we were kids or when I was a kid, there wasn't, you get two choices. It was like, a grown-up said, so you're going to go do it. And so much of my work as a parent, I feel like has been to undo a lot of that and just go like, well, I get that there's a power dynamic, and actually it serves my kid on some level to be able to respect that, because I can't ask them to go into the world and have that look completely different from our home. And they need some agency and some say and some opportunities to make choices. And I need to approach them like whole people, not just like, you know, the folks who are going to do whatever I ask them to do. And then I get frustrated when they don't.
Yeah, and what you just said, Gwen, is so important, because we have to do that every day. Like every interaction, right, is an opportunity to do that. I think that maybe one of the misconceptions about SEL is that it's one and done, right, or one size fits all. And the reality is that at the core, SEL is how we are with ourselves, right, and how we are with each other. So that means that every moment that we have with our kids is an opportunity to practice these skills. And I think that even for us, that we do this professionally, we still have to bring that intentionality to our parenting, right? For me, in the example with the cake, I was also reflecting this morning and thinking about how in the way that I grew up, my mom always said, oh, let me do it. You can't do it, let me do it. And I hated that, right? And in a way, I was to the point where I was going to do that to my kid. And I think as you are talking about unpacking some of the ways in which we were raised, so we can maybe just not make the same mistakes, right? Or the things that didn't work for us, that we are offering a different experience to our kids, knowing that we won't be perfect, and that's okay, right? The goal of, I think, bringing these skills into our homes is not to be perfect, but to keep trying and to start fresh every morning.
Lorea, I really loved what you said about, it's not one and done. And for folks who are on the call, it can seem like, we have this packaged, even if it's a good packaged SEL program, let's do it today, and then it's going to be the rest of the year. It really, you may have the perfect package and you have a kid who's dysregulated, which changes the whole dynamic. And so being okay with, yeah, I heard someone say to me before, Michael, well, I thought you were an SEL person. You got upset. And I go, well, you know what? Because I study social emotional learning or do EQ work doesn't prevent me from being human. I think part of the power of SEL or an EQ is that we have the ability, even if we get it wrong, to come back and say, you know what, Michael, or you know what, Ellis, I did this and this wasn't how I wanted to treat you. Or if it's with your partner, or if it's with someone in your workplace, this, Gwen, as you said, it's a dynamic approach. And so because it's a dynamic approach, it gives us second and third chances for humanity, which many in our culture now are not allowing for second chances. And I think that is something that we work against, to work towards a different outcome.
And I think you're talking about something, like that, it really comes back to that piece of like what you want to model for your kids, right? Like there's such a high bar, I think, in parenting right now, and in the conversations around being an effective parent and not centering our own humanity as parents. Like we're allowed to have reactions. Like it would be really weird if we didn't. And like, we don't really want to model that for our kids either. And so I feel like part of what I'm hearing you say, and what I think about a lot too, is just like in being human and then recovering from like a moment where things didn't go the way that you meant for them to. You're showing your kid, like, I'm not expecting perfection from you either. I'm expecting you to be human. And here's one way that you could approach repair. And I think often those moments of repair can be sort of like the most valuable learning moments for us and for our kids.
Yeah, and I can share that I've had like very special moments with my kids when I am getting upset with myself because I made a mistake. And they come and say, it's okay, Mom, we all make mistakes. And they are like showing that compassionate side, because when they have made a mistake, I've said, hey, that was a mistake. Maybe it was a poor choice, we can fix it, right? We either start new the following day, right? We try again, or maybe it's something that we can physically fix, right? And I think that as parents, when we model that we also make mistakes, that you know, I often tell my kids, hey, I'm sorry, in this situation I didn't do my best, and I'm sorry. And because I never want them to go to bed thinking that the things that happen during the day, that takes away from the love that I have for me. And one of as we are doing this event during SEL week and celebrating SEL day, one of the questions that is being asked is, what's your SEL superpower? And what I shared, it was unconditional love, because I always want my kids to know, no matter what happened during the day, that they are loved, they are cared for, right? And I think that when we recognize when we make mistakes, when we show that vulnerability to, we are modeling that it's okay for them to recognize when they make mistakes and to be open about it.
It's funny. I always refer to my middle son as like he's like my most heavily parented child. Like he's needed the most guidance in his life. And so, as you were talking, I was thinking about two examples with him. One where he came to me and he was like, "Hey, listen, like, you got a little edge to you. Like, I think you're upset about something that doesn't actually have to do with me, and you might be taking it out on me right now." And I was like, I'm so glad that we can have that conversation. And like, I can go like, yeah, good call. You're totally right. I'm really like, let me go take a beat, you know, and like get myself together, because you don't need to be receiving where I'm coming from. You know, and also having moments with him where at the end of the night, you know, I'm putting him to bed and then I'll say like, all right, so like tomorrow, let's, you know, try to do this differently. He's like, it's okay. I know you still love me anyway. And sometimes hearing that from him is like a good reminder, like, yeah, even though I am super annoyed, I do still love you anyway, you know, but I'm glad that he's like internalized that message.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Gwen, I can't help but see in the chat, and I know I'm hoping that I didn't mess up our format. The question was so powerful, talking about superpowers, and Lorea mentioned that. I hope folks will really hear that, because part of this conversation is, you know, one, what do we think ours are, but also someone said, how do I find that out? Those are the kinds of questions that we want to ask as leaders together. And I think I know that there's some powerful assessments out there that we should explore. And when we get to that point, we should. But Lorea, I really appreciate you've been a great colleague and mentor for me. And even as you write in your book, a lot of the work is about self-reflection. It's very hard to be in a classroom. And if your student is operating in a space that's not healthy, if you haven't had a chance to deal with that, they won't have a chance to come to any kind of resolve. And same way in our families, some people said, we're amazing parents. Boy, see us see us tomorrow. You know, you'll see that the SEL is an everyday process. But I guess my heart for this group, as we're parents and also teachers, is that every day we have to keep, you know, on my worst day, I have to remember what's that one thing that I did well, because that's a strategy. Because if I don't use those strategies, I'll go into this abyss of, oh my goodness, you know, and then 5 weeks later, we're still in the same place. So I appreciate you talking about the superpower.
Yeah, and I think just back to the someone put like, how can we find out our SEL superpower? And I think that's again another misconception, that SEL skills live outside of us. We all have the capacity, like we are wired for empathy, for example, right? Like our brains are wired for empathy. So we have that ability to connect with the feelings of our kids, even when it's difficult. We have that ability. And I think that, as Michael was saying, part of this process is to think about, like, to be self-reflective and really think about what are your strengths as a person, right? And somehow and I ask that question sometimes when I work with educators in professional development, and I can tell you that we adults have a hard time coming up with what we are good at, what are our strengths. And I think as parents, we are always thinking about what we can do better, right? And of course, there are many things that we can always do better, but I think that we cannot work on being better unless we have that foundation, that clarity of like, what are our, Gwen talks about values, what are our strengths, right? What is the foundation that serves us to, and is kind of like that that base to propel us to do things that we need to improve, right? But we need to develop that clarity of those things that are strengths in ourselves.
Lorea, I'm just throwing here in the chat, just kind of piggybacking off of what you shared. You know, what are your strengths? What are the opportunities to grow? Yes, there are some specific assessments and some questions that we just don't ask. Like, what am I really good at? We have some instincts that each of us, as Lorea talked about, we're wired for, thinking about what are those instincts that when you walk into a room, what do you notice? That's probably a superpower. And so, like, how do I develop that? Well, when is that awareness helpful? When is it a challenge? And then who can we partner with? There's some basic things that we can do that are not a certification process that really, particularly with parents, sometimes we don't have time to do a certification process, but just beginning to do more of reflection with ourselves. But also I've asked my own kids, well, Michael, what do you think daddy does well? Ooh, I have to brace for that. But as we're talking about social emotional learning, he says, Daddy, you know, you do this really well. And here's the area that I'd like to see you grow in. And I'm like, and I don't feel beat up. I feel like, man, this kid is getting what we're attempting to put out, and we're finding a way to communicate in a world and environment where communication is polarized. So I think all of these opportunities really help to, we get to develop each other as a community.
I think it's really helpful. I mean, I like Lorea said, I tend to use this frame of like values, like what do I want my kids to be able to do at the end of the day? And if I use that frame, for me, that works in a self-reflection process to be able to say like, well, I think that they're able to do this part of that. And this is the part that I need to be able to kind of get a little better at supporting them in, sort of realizing like my goals for them or their goals for themselves. And I really like what you said, Michael, about asking them to participate in that process. I think about that really similarly. And I was thinking too, even just reflecting on the example I gave of a high-low jack, I'm the one who can never come up with my high-low jack from the day. The kids are always like, come on, mommy, like wrap it up, like let's do it. And I'm like, I don't know, like I'm so busy not thinking about my own day because I'm really busy thinking about them, or like my focus is elsewhere. And so having them see me struggle with that and go like, what, you know, and then I can say, oh my gosh, like I just realized like one of the things I struggle with is being able to make sure that like I do what I need to do for myself, and that I'm not so focused on what needs to happen for the group that I'm like losing sight of my own experience. Does anyone else have that happen? You know, like, because I definitely have a couple kids in my family who sort of lean that way too. But yeah, I think that's a really important piece, is like soliciting that feedback too. So I don't know if, sorry, Michael, go ahead. Were you say something?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know if folks have other kind of questions, or we can certainly open up in that way if there are specific things folks want us to chat about. And I guess in the meantime, Lorea and Michael, are there other pieces that you feel like are really important for us to share about how to integrate SEL into families that we haven't covered yet?
I think there's one aspect that, as you were talking, Gwen, I was thinking about. For me, one of the challenges as a parent is to really align the choices that I make on a daily basis with those values. And sometimes that becomes difficult because we are, busy working professionals. We have these expectations and these hopes for our kids. And sometimes it's hard to be intentional about the decisions that we make on a daily basis, based on the values that we hold. So I think that's an important reflection for parents to really reflect on what are the values of the families, not just of the parent, but how can you co-create, right? Do that with your kids. And think about like, what are the things that are important for us as a family, right? Come up with those values. And then I think that it's easier when we get so busy to think about, well, are we making decisions that cultivate those values, or are we moving away? And I have to say that, and when you are farther away than me, but I'm like terrified of like the teenage years with my two girls, and thinking about, oh, they are going to start to pull away, but can I build something now, right, in terms of the values and the strength of the family, that when they are out there, like testing limits and just being a lot more outward focused versus, focus on the family, that they can carry those values with them. And also that I'm like helping them develop the tools that they will need to navigate the outside world. And sometimes, as going back to Michael's story, my concern for my kids is not the decisions that they will make, but the context, how the context that they will be interacting with will treat them, right? And how we support our kids to, to be safe, but at the same time to, you don't want to protect them so much that they are not trying to interact with the outside world, right? I think that there's a balance between, freedom and accountability and being safe in the environment. And I think that as a parent, that's, I think, a territory that I'll be navigating, but I'm already thinking about how can I prepare for that.
You go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to say in the chat, Matt put, are there reflections that we can use for parenting? I think one of the ideas is to keep it really simple and to ask questions like, how are we doing today? How was dinner? How was whatever this activity was? Just something simple, because if we make it really simple, everyone can be a part of that. And I find the more simple I can make it, the better. But also there's some emotional intelligence models that we can share later on that can just help you to see what are you feeling? Because I'm discovering I have one answer. How are you? Bad. Right? And that the problem is there's all of these other emotions that are involved. And so when we begin to realize that there's so many emotions we can choose, it helps us as both parents and as children to navigate. So just to that question, a reflection might be, how was the pickup? How was driving? How was dinner? How did you, and because the goal is to get those feelings out and then to begin to process them together.
Yeah, I love that. And I also, there are a couple of things that I feel like are worth mentioning, especially because we're all parents of multiple children. And then I want to get to the questions in the chat. But one of the things that I think we haven't said yet that I think about a lot is that, any like self-regulation is a prerequisite for sort of any empathy or social understanding or capacity to, process what's going on in a moment. And so I was thinking a lot about your example, Michael, of like trying to navigate something with your son where you're like, okay, I'm going to make a choice. And the choice I'm going to make here is going to be to use a strategy that I know is going to reduce your frustration, even if it's strategy I don't really feel like I should have to use anyway. And I'm making a choice about that right now, where I have one of my kids who just came home from school and I'm like, all right, here, like a lot of planning went into being like, don't interrupt me. Like, I'm going to set you up. I got a plan for you. We got to follow the plan. Afterward, we're going to do this thing. And for some of my kids, it takes more of that like early investment or like that sort of pre-planning. And for others, it doesn't. And so I guess really quick, and then I do want to make sure we get to the questions in the chat. I feel like a family is a really interesting context to be able to talk about these skills. And as you've both been talking about your kids, I just sort of wonder, like one of the things I think about, because my kids will be like, well, that's not fair. How come he got to, they don't really say it that often. They used to say that more. They don't really now that they're older, because they're like, my stock response would just be like, well, because that's what they need. And when you need something, we'll make sure you get it. But like, it doesn't look the same like for everyone. And so I just wonder how you navigate that in the context of sibling dynamics.
I think that was an important learning lesson for me, because my kids, as many kids are, they are very different from each other. So as when I had my first daughter, I was like, oh, this is what I should be expecting. And then I had my second child and I was like, wait a minute, this is not working. What do I do now? Right. And that goes from like, oh, the when they were babies, like their sleep hours, how they like to be held was different. Right. One loved to be really tight and wrapped up. The other one, couldn't handle that and would cry. So I think that the question is like, you have to be the best parent that you can be for each child, right? And that means that the tools and the strategies that you use with one kid, sometimes they don't work for the other, right? And I think for me, it goes back to seeing like, who is that child, and not, and this is hard for parents, I think, not to do the comparison. It's like, what is it that you need, right? What is it gonna work for you? Let me try that. And sometimes it does take several trial and error, right? You try different things and see what works. But I think for me, at least, is letting go of that, oh, that's the expectation, that's the way that it's gonna go, and really look at the child and see what is that the child needs, and then trying to help them with that.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add, I think the differentiation, we're right in the midst of it. We have a 10, 8, and 7-year-old. Well, why did he get that? And first I would be reacting to that often, and I still do sometimes. I'm coming to the realization that, well, Mike is getting this because this is what he's working on. And so that makes sense for him to have, remember that you got something yesterday that was for you, and trying to help them to understand what is for them so that they don't need to compare is important. It's self-regulation for me because it helps me to slow down and identify them. And it also helps them because they're going, oh, you see me. And as a family unit, and we homeschool our kids, so we're together 24 hours a day. A lot of management, things changing, but to really see the kids is something that we've been working on, and it's showing us some good dividends.
Yeah, and I think too, in terms of, right, that, like somebody just put in the chat, the language of the fair versus equal. I think too, to your point, Michael, like thinking about what you're modeling also, right? Like your other kids then see that narrative of, well, this is something they struggle with, so let's all support them, and now my kids will be like, oh yeah, like so-and-so has a hard time, getting their whatever together, or gets really upset in these situations. Like, I'll talk to him about it beforehand so that like we can make sure that we avoid a conflict. And like, for me, I'm like, that's great. Like, that's what I ultimately, when I think about, again, my values, my goals, I'm like, I want you to be able to solve problems with people and be like a kind person in the world. So like, we're doing it, you're figuring it out, and you're finding ways to do that in those micro moments in the context of our family. There are a couple questions in the chat. One was about being trauma informed. So I just want to make sure that Michael and Lorea, you saw it. So can you speak about trauma informed and trauma responsive dimensions of SEL work, and how do we enact forgiveness in ourselves and in our kids?
I'll let you take that one, Michael.
Okay. Yeah. My perspective is that we have the word trauma informed. The world has been traumatized for a long time. And so when we talk about trauma informed language, it's a greater awareness that people come to every situation with history. So some kids come from homes that are single parent homes, or homes where there's distress, or we all have a different level of how we come to a space. And so when I work with teachers, we talk about what are the different layers of who you are. How do you want to engage that person who comes from 2-parent home, but the parents aren't there? There's some challenges there. How about someone that comes from a 1-parent home and everything is going right? So it's really for me as a diversity practitioner, thinking about trauma-informed practice is greater awareness. How am I feeling about a moment? For instance, with my son, there are some traumatic experiences happening there around race and gender, and I have to be aware that I don't want to limit it to just one, because he said specifically to me, Daddy, he said, Daddy, did that person do it to me because I'm brown? Right. So this was an interaction that he had with a white person, possibly, right? And there are people in the world who do things that are unkind. So when I think about SEL being a tool for trauma-informed practice, it's a greater awareness of people's lived experience.
And I think it goes back to something we discussed earlier, that one size doesn't fit all, right? And I think that part of the work is unpacking what are some of those messages that are shared in social cultural context, and to see how those messages are damaging. And yesterday was International Women's Day, and having 2 girls at home, I often think about what are the messages that they hear about what are the emotions that are accepted for being a girl, for being a woman, right? and what happens when they show anger in school, right? And how could they be disciplined if they are showing anger versus if a boy shows anger? So there is a dimension of emotional expression, how we express our emotions in public spaces, that has a racial and a gender based context. And I think part of the work around thinking about trauma and SEL and that diversity component is unpacking some of the messages that we hear in society. And I think that the place of the home is such an important part of doing that work. And for me, I'm raising bilingual kids, and just having an understanding of how that part of their identity plays out in the world when they are outside and we are in the playground speaking in Spanish to each other, and what are people's reactions to that. I think that there is an aspect of validating who they are as individuals, but also to question some of the messages that they hear outside, and to create the home as a space where they can have those discussions and those interactions with their caregivers.
Yeah, Lorea, I just jump on in one more second here. Is back to the sense of trauma. I really believe that every walk of life has something that's going on with them, and particularly with teachers that may be nervous to say, "I'm not sure how to engage this." What I try to do is to say, "I wonder, I hear that, and what might be standing in the way from you wanting to engage? What feelings are there?" Because sometimes the things that are stopping me are personal experiences that caused me not to go forward. And so trauma is a real thing that all of us have. And how do we give each other or support each other in the courage? I think the big piece for me is how do we develop that courage and the creative space and the brave space to say, this is what's going on for me. Like what Lorea said, talking with her daughters about what does it mean to identify as female in a world that may have dominant messages. That's not a new concept. I think us being able to engage it thoughtfully and compassionately is something that we are doing more of in this day.
I think there's also a piece about sort of what happens to all of us sort of on a physiological level when we're in those moments of feeling. And I think the language of being triggered is like somewhat overused and misused at times, but when we're in those situations where someone's engaging in a particular way that like has a really, like, we have a really evocative or like a really heightened response to, I think it's just important to acknowledge like no one is their best self in that moment when they're compromised. And so like I was saying before, this idea that like empathy is self-regulation is a prerequisite for empathy. Like I'm not going to be able to be open to a conversation if something's just happened that I'm kind of reflecting on based on my own previous experiences. Similarly, I think this happens often to many of us in parenting. And someone had a question a minute ago about sort of like what are some strategies around thinking about reparenting yourself, or kind of exploring how your parent, the way you were parented influences how you parent. And I think about that a lot. And I think about like, what are my expectations and my goals for my, like, how do I show up in these ways? And like, it's silly things like, like my expectations around cleanliness. Like I came from a home where like it had to be really clean and you cleaned up after yourself, and and so I had these expectations for my kids, and sometimes they're like, God, why are you so rigid about this? And I'm like, I don't know, but I do know that I get really annoyed when you leave your stuff out, and then that's something for me to look at. And I just use that as one example, but I think, to kind of tie it into that, but I think that there are many, and I think part of what often I think about when I think about sort of like a trauma-informed SEL perspective is also just making sure like Michael said, when you walk into a space, like we all have stuff underneath the surface that people can't see that's affecting how we're going to respond in a particular moment. So it's really about acknowledging that and then saying like, okay, what strategies do I need? And when do I want to just like use the opportunity to sort of make that transparent for the people around me. Hey, you know what? I'm starting to get really frustrated. I'm going to use a strategy and let me show you how I'm going to do that. Like, like loud sound, like I feel like this often comes up with people who are really startled by loud sounds. If things get really cacophonous in a space or really loud and overwhelming, they'll kind of shut down or get really like reactive to things. And this often happens in a classroom setting, but it can certainly happen at home. I think in those moments going like, you know what, loud sounds are really hard for me. Let's figure out how to create a space where I can kind of settle. We can all settle, I can settle, and then I know that I'm going to be able to explain this better. Just one example.
There was also a question about the value of SEL in schools that we haven't touched on, and I think it's important. The question says, speak about the value of SEL in schools and what is the best way for parents to approach the schools to get this learning installed. And if already installed, how should parents best monitor that the school is doing it well and comprehensively?
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that again, not to get political, but SEL sometimes is perceived as something that it actually is not. And that's why I started saying these are life skills, right? These are really tools and practices and strategies that we all need to navigate and be productive workers and good citizens and just good people in general. And when it comes to schools, the role of emotions in learning is very important. So from a parent advocacy perspective, knowing that teachers at where your kids go to school are really looking at what is that role of emotions in learning, that they are really integrating SEL in everything they do, from teaching those skills explicitly so your kids can learn. And all of the things that we have been talking here today, but also that they are integrating those skills into their academic content. And when they are teaching math, that kids learn how to cope with the feelings that may come from maybe trying to engage with a difficult task, right? Like all the different emotions that may come during a school day are important sources of data and things that teachers should be looking at and using as information to help kids. So from a parent perspective, like I would say the first step is to ask the question with curiosity, right? To say, oh, how are you supporting kids at this school to learn about these social emotional skills? And again, do it as parents and schools working together in collaboration. I think that we need to be allies in this work and not oppositional, but really ask that first question and then help them to see if they are not there or you are not happy with how much SEL they are doing, to be able to advocate for what the kids need in that school.
Yeah, kind of what, on the point of what Lorea was sharing, as I work with schools, a lot of it is to say, how do we not just have a SEL moment? How is it when I'm doing my curriculum, implementing my curriculum, I'm thinking about this idea? So I use a model of, it's called AOD, Awareness, Options, Direct Actions. So when I'm doing a science curriculum or English or history, whatever it is, what are the cognitive and emotional pieces that I need to pay attention to? So I think the value for educators is, if I'm a substitute teacher in a class that I've never done before, there's a lot of emotion there because those kids are 10th graders and I'm not ready, and you all of the things that you had. So I go, instead of me going afraid, I go, I'm a substitute teacher, and I wonder how many of you have been a place where you're new before. So I'm asking a question to the people I'm working with to bring it down so we're connected. Then go, well, what are some of the things that you're learning in your space? So it's them working with me, and as a teacher, I'm not having to manage the group, I'm facilitating learning. So I think it's a tremendous value for teachers in schools, but also to make sure that we're taking care of or tending to the emotional state of educators. It's really important. So I know that Matt put in a link that talks about how to engage schools. So I think Lorea spoke to that really well.
I like what you're saying, both of you, and I think the other piece that I would presence is just like that to me, like, you can have a great SEL curriculum and you can do all the lessons in it, and unless you're really, like you're saying, like you're both saying, really thoroughly integrating that into your practice or the frame you're bringing to your teaching or your school, you're undermining people. I think people often unintentionally undermine good intentions. So we walk in, we think we're doing something, we have a curriculum in place, we're like, yep, we're an SEL school. I often ask people, like, well, what does it really mean to be an SEL school? Like, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean for them to adopt an SEL program? And it's great. Like, there are lots of really wonderful programs out there, and trust, safety, social skills, emotion management, all of it is built-in micro moments, and mostly relationally. So it's important to really do that work of like supporting educators in being able to do the like kind of kind of walk the talk in a particular way. And so to answer your question, I think that there are these moments where like we don't necessarily, you know, like someone could be doing a great curriculum, undermining it unintentionally. We might see some things, our kid might be coming home with some comments that we're concerned about, and it can be really hard to figure out how to deal with those situations. I think attending to the educator that you're approaching in those situations first can be really helpful. Sounds like things are, you know, this is what I heard. What was your experience of that? How can I better support my kids so that they're understanding what's going on? And also modeling, like modeling and drop off and modeling in the hallway, or like if there are any interactions that you have with the school, demonstrating in whatever ways you can, sort of like a sort of a different or nuanced or a more like SEL informed approach that you're hoping that they also adopt. Not that it's like your sole responsibility to do that, but I think that there are ways that we can cue folks, because it is those micro moments that I think tend to make a bigger difference.
And also the secret out of the box is for us working with educators is that educators are always saying, oh, and what about the parents, right? And in this case, because they want parents to be doing this work, they want the support from the families. And I think that it's a matter of like, can we speak the same language, right? Sometimes it's just a matter of like, okay, finding out how the school is referring to SEL skills, if they use a framework, if they use a particular language. It's a matter of knowing what that language is. And sometimes the reality is schools are not great at communicating that to parents, but I think that there's such a great opportunity to do this work better in kind of like crossing that bridge between educators and parents and really working together, because at the end of the day, we all have the same goals, right? We want to support and see those kids thriving. And I think that at this, like everybody's trying their best to support kids effectively, right? It's a matter of like, can we join forces and do it in collaborative ways instead of in opposition?
So we're coming, I appreciate that. And I think you're right. Like, I say it's yeah, like everyone sort of sits on from their own perspective, kind of sees things from their own perspective. So it's helpful to think about how we all can be coordinated. I want to just make sure before we end that there was one more question, and I don't know, Michael and Lorea, if you have specific ideas, but ways that people can learn more about SEL. Like if you have, I know that there's some suggestions that have been put in the chat, but if there's other sort of tools or suggestions you have.
Shameless plug for my book. I have a book that's called Teaching with the Heart in Mind, and is written for educators, but really the content is applicable to parenting as well. And I would be, very honored if you decide to purchase and read it and apply that model into your parenting life. And I think Matt dropped a handout in the chat that you can see the Heart in Mind model, and I'll drop another link to my website where you can learn more. And I have a parenting newsletter that comes out on Sundays. So if you are interested, I'll put that into the chat as well.
Yes, as I know we have just about a couple of minutes. One of the ways that has really grown me as a EQ practitioner is through the work of 6seconds.org. They have a tremendous amount of tools for teachers and parents. They have some programming that has really been helpful in terms of systematizing how we use SEL with students, but also with educators. And so I can put the link in there as well.
Thank you. I'll turn it back over to you, Matt.
All right. First of all, I want to say thank you, Gwen, Lorea, and Michael. That was a fabulous conversation. I'm glad we did finally record it. Thank you, Lorea, for reminding me that was my chore. I had dropped the ball on that. I do have a couple other things to share with folks before we close out. We also have a newsletter at Equip Our Kids for parents. You'll get one tip. It's really short. You'll get it every week. You can go to our website and sign up. Just go to equipourkids.org/newsletter. And, just all you really need is your email address. We'd take a little more, but that's all you need to do. I'd also say you can learn a lot more about SEL tomorrow on actual SEL Day, March 10th. There is a day-long summit going on from the Social Emotional Learning Alliance for the US. You can go to selday.org/summit and find out what's going on. It's definitely a drop-in, drop-out thing. You're not expected to be there all day. I know there's going to be student voice sessions. There's going to be educator sessions. There's going to be sort of workforce preparedness sessions. A lot of great stuff going on. So if you have the time, definitely drop in on the summit. And with that, I'm going to say thank you to everybody for attending. This has been a fabulous conversation. I really appreciate how interactive everybody was in bringing their real concerns and thoughts and questions. I think it made a great conversation. So we will be in touch soon, and have a great SEL week. Take care, everybody.